Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I am your host, Benedict Hein. And if you are new to this show, welcome. So stoked to have you. This is where we teach you how to make records at your jam space, at your home studio, wherever you are, DIY style. If you are already a listener, thank you for coming back. If you get any value out of these past episodes that you have listened to, please go to Apple Podcasts or your podcast app of choice that allows reviews and testimonials. And if you leave us a review there and a couple of nice lines like about the show and 5-star reviews, stuff like that we would really appreciate that because that helps us reach more people like you and help more people like you make better records. So thank you for coming back and thank you for leaving us a review. Now today, I want to announce something that is brand new and that I think will help you a lot with your mixes, and that is a free resource that I've put out. It's called Standout Mixes, and you can get it if you go to the selfrecordingband.com/standout mixes, and it's called the subtitle is The DIY Musician's Guide to Exciting Mixes That Stand Out and Connect. And that's really what I think it is. And in this episode, we're going to talk about that. So again, go to the selfrecordingband.com/standout mixes. And yeah, as always, I'm here not alone, but with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. Hello, buddy. How are you?
Hey, man. I'm great, dude. Had a great week. Stoked to be on here. I'm just in music mode lately, so this is always the highlight of my week.
Awesome. That's good to hear. It's the highlight of your week, and it's also the first thing of your week, right?
Yes, it's a great thing to start on.
Perfect.
Wake up Monday morning, record a podcast, have some coffee, get going. It's awesome.
Yeah. Awesome. Today, Malcolm's fresh, rested, coffee-driven brain is like clashing with my very tired end of the day brain, so we'll see how that goes. I'm not at my best today, I'm afraid, but we'll see. No, all good. I'm prepared. I'm ready. I'm stoked. So I hope you had a great weekend, first of all, Malcolm. Sorry, I didn't even ask you today.
Oh, no, I did, man. I did. Good. But yeah, no, let's get into it. This episode is exciting. This resource is exciting, so I want to get it out there.
Cool. Perfect. All right, so let's dive into what I call the DIY Musician's Guide to Exciting Mixes That Stand Out and Connect. What it is it is a checklist and a video, and you want to first download the checklist, and then you want to watch the video going through the checklist while you watch it. And in the video, I'm going through every single step on this checklist, and I'm going to show you how to implement all of this, what it's actually meant to do for you. And it's a step-by-step action plan, basically. And the reason why I made this is that in mixing, and we often talked about this on the episodes on this podcast, by the way, the reason is that in mixing, most people, in my opinion, skip the most important things because what matters most is often doesn't seem as exciting and fun to learn as some other things that are less relevant. So there's the saying, I think I said it before too, it's the pros never don't do the basics, which is very, very true. And we never basically skip some of the essential foundational stuff because we know how important that stuff is. And in this resource, I'm going to show you those basics, but trust me, you want to still, you really want to download that and watch it. It's not boring. It's not like things you've already heard, because I think I'm showing you some concepts in there and some actionables and some hacks and tricks to implement this that you might have not found anywhere else before. I think you haven't found it anywhere else before. This is really a unique thing that I built here. And it is around the concept of getting the right balance and doing things right without even touching plugins. And again, this sounds trivial, but it's really very, very, very important. The most important thing about mixes, that plus great source tones should give you a mix that is better than 90% of DIY mixes out there, because a lot of people work with crappy songs, crappy source tones, and then they immediately go to plugins and advanced techniques, and they immediately try to tweak things and sort of cover up mistakes that they've made along the way. And what comes out is an overprocessed, unbalanced mix that might have a little bit of punch and impact, but it's just not balanced. It's focused on the wrong things. It doesn't take you on an emotional journey. And if you have a mix and you do exactly those things that this resource is about, then you are one of the very few people who actually do this right, and this will make your mix immediately better while still, but at the same time being faster and easier in a way. So
yeah, that's awesome. It's a video with a companion checklist, or vice versa, depending on how you look at it. But you get both. And just to quickly clarify, there's going to be, if you don't remember that and you're worried you're driving right now and you can't write down the link, it will be in the show notes for this episode as well. Yes. So you can just right through your podcast app, find the link to this resource as well. Check that out. And I want to quickly add as well that if you are not interested in mixing at all, that doesn't really matter, because knowing what makes a good mix helps you record good tracks as well. It's reverse engineering in a way. So it's totally relevant and useful knowledge regardless to what you plan to do in the studio.
For sure, absolutely. And by the way, the idea for this resource came from the following. I noticed that a lot of, like when we started out, I have to start this way. When we started out with the self-recording band, we focused only on recording and producing, and we ignored mixing almost entirely. We talked about it sometimes, but we always said that we don't recommend you mix your own songs if you're not really experienced and you don't also work with other bands, because if you only work on your own stuff and that is the first record you ever mixed, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to make a really, really good professional sounding mix. But you can write great songs and you might be able to capture them well with some guidance, and then you can give it to somebody who knows how to mix. And that's the way we recommend you do it. That's the proper way of doing it. But of course, people are interested in mixing, and we received and still do receive a lot of mixing related questions because people just want to learn it and want to do it. And I did it myself, so I understand this. So we started talking about mixing topics on this podcast and, of course, answering mixing related questions. And I thought about how I could create a resource that was about mixing, but is not misleading and confusing and is not something that requires like years of experience. And because there's so many mixing checklists and guides and stuff out there that are true, like the content is true, but it's so hard to apply it without the experience. And it doesn't give you immediately better results most of the time. And sometimes it's very confusing, it's conflicting information. So I thought about a mixing resource that is absolutely applicable for DIY musicians, DIY producers, that covers the essence of mixing, the most important stuff. And I thought about what is the 80-20, like what do you have to get right no matter what, and what do you need to get right first. And I wanted to make something that makes sure if you apply that, you already have something that works, and then you can continue to practice and develop your ear and techniques and polish it even further, but you have something that works that you can show to other people that gets your song across. And this is why I did a poll online in our community, and I asked people what they wanted, and I proposed this idea and everybody was soaked. And so that's why I created this. That's the story behind it. It's a mixing guide for people who are not mixers yet.
Yeah.
And so that was the idea. And now on this episode, I think we should just walk you through what's on that checklist and in that video, and the in-depth teaching, the application of it, and the how-tos and the examples and all of that. You'll find that in the video, of course, and on this checklist. But we just want to tell you what's on there so that hopefully you will download it and you see the value in it, because I really think it helps you. Yeah, and I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on all those things, Malcolm, because as always with mixing and music production, there's not one way to make a record or one process that you should go through when you're mixing. There's multiple different ways, and they can all work. And maybe there's some things in it that you do differently, or where the order is different, because I always follow I've developed my own way of doing things, and I follow a certain order when I produce and mix. But I know that some people don't follow the same order and they still get great results. So if you have something else here, I don't want this to be confusing, but if you have some thoughts on some of these points or provide some context maybe for people, or make it less of a rule book, then I'm happy to hear your thoughts on this too.
Of course, yeah. No, I've had a look through this pretty thoroughly, and I think we're pretty aligned. And as we've actually discussed like our processes on previous episodes as well, and there's always differences, but like you said, the basics always have to get done, right? So it's kind of just a matter of what order they get done, not if they get done.
Yes, agreed, exactly. All right, so it all starts with session prep. This is step 1. This is preparing your session. I have another video on how I do this, actually. The link to that is on the checklist. So if you want to check out that video, you can do it too, but you need the checklist first, or you're already on our email list, so you probably already got this video. Anyway, so the first step is to properly set yourself up for mixing, to set up the session. Then once you've done that, you want to save a template so you can reuse that later and you don't have to start from scratch every single time. Especially if you're a band with the same sort of setup and arrangement, it's definitely wise to have a template and not having to start over again every single time you record a song, especially if things don't change as much. That's very basic.
Oh, that's crucial actually, because it's all about removing the non-musical things from your path. So anything that is like slow, tedious, and not creative, you want to just automate it if you can, so you can spend more time listening to music.
Yes, 100%. Then the next thing is, that's something I know that not everybody does, but I swear by it. The next thing is you want to define a monitoring level. And I have monitoring levels in brackets because I have 3 different sort of reference levels. One is where I spend 90% of my time at, and then I have a quieter and a louder level. that I switch to. But I think, to me at least, to my workflow, it's crucial to have this reference level because that helps me learn my room and my speakers really well. And if I just found out that I didn't do that for a long time, but I found that when I'm jumping around constantly and I mix at different levels all the time, it gives me perspective, but I also never really learned what my system and my room sounded like. And once I started sticking to one reference volume level, I started developing a much more detailed hearing in a way. I could immediately tell if something sounded loud or quiet, if something had an impact or not. I don't know. It's just our hearing is just not linear, and it sounds different at different levels. So having one level that you calibrate your ears to sort of really helped me. And I know mastering people do this absolutely all the time, like almost everybody. But in mixing, some people like to just have levels all over the place, and I think it helps me in mixing too. So that's why I recommend it.
It speeds up the learning process and just makes it so you have a reliable kind of reference. Like you said, you know what your room sounds like. You know what like a loudness translates to as well. It's kind of a hard thing to explain, but take our word on it. Try and stick to one level to start. I use 2 levels generally. I've got a dim button on my controller, so I'm just going down to quiet, back up to loud, and then of course my hand does creep over to the volume knob every once in a while and experiment.
Yeah, exactly. That's pretty much what I meant with 3 levels. Like I have 2 set levels, and then the third one is basically I just crank it without. I just every now and again I just want to hear what it and feel what it sounds like when it's cranked. So yeah, and how to exactly do that? The levels that I use precisely and what my thoughts are behind this is in the video. So this would be an entire episode in of itself. So, but it's in there. The next step is once you prepare yourself, you have your monitoring set up, your levels defined, you have your session set up and all of that. The first part of the real mix to me is the discovery phase, is where I learn the song, basically. So it's a really quick part of it because I want to react intuitively and quickly to the music, to the musical material. I don't look at any numbers or I just listen to the song and I get a feel for what's on the track. So I just throw up the faders. I make mental notes as I discover those tracks. I might make actual notes maybe while I discover the track. Sometimes it's just something I remember later. Other times I need to write it down. I mute solo different groups of tracks or individual tracks. And yeah, basically just go through the song, 1, 2 passes maybe. And then I get a feel for what's actually in front of me. And I have to do this really, really quickly and intuitively. And I don't know, there's something about this initial reaction and this initial very quick balance that you create that is special because that's a one-time moment. This never happens again. You hear the song for the first time exactly once, and that's how every listener will react to it the first time. So the way you intuitively balance things is you should pay attention to that because there's a reason for why you react that way.
Totally. Crucial moment. Like you said, it only happens once. You get to hear the song. Well, I guess it's tricky if you recorded the song. You've probably heard it all before. But in Benny and I's situation where we're getting a song to mix and it's our first time really getting eyes on it, it's like that's a super important part of the process.
Yeah, a good point actually, because you probably heard the song before because you've recorded it. But still, with some distance between the recording and the mixing, and all the faders at 0 again, like down to like not 0, but like turned down again, and you start from scratch, it's still a different kind of perspective. And the more you dive into the mix, the more the closer you will get again. So even if it's not the first time, it's still probably the one time where you're most objective about your own song.
Yeah, that actually brings up the good point of giving yourself some time away from it before you start mix. And a lot of mixers or producers who also mix will actually export their tracks into a new session to do this, to have to start fresh, like lose all of the volume fadings, like and mixing they've done on their tracking session because it forces them to kind of look at it fresh again.
Yeah, absolutely. And the next part is basic gain staging, which means I explained this in the video how I exactly do this, but this teaches you how I use a VU meter in the mix bus and why I think it's useful. I show you why I start with faders at 0, so not all the way down, but at unity gain. So 0 is like, when you look at 0 on a console doesn't mean all the way down. It means 0.
Default.
Default. Yeah, exactly. So, and I tell you why I do that and why I like to keep them there as long as possible. I show you how you set levels without moving the faders and why I think that's a good idea up to a certain point. I show you how to use a VU meter, and I show you how to use things like clip gain plugins, or the input gain, and how you get the gain staging between plugins right. And I know that some people, again, this is something, some mixers completely ignore that and just do whatever. I think that it's good to follow the sort of analog way of working and just have a basic understanding of gain staging because some plugins emulate analog circuitries and you can absolutely overdrive them without knowing. And unless you stick to purely digital processes and plugins with 32-bit float and all these things, I think you should pay attention to your gain staging. And there's other benefits to it too. Like even if you don't get clipping, there's benefits to having a better fader resolution and to not overloading your mix bus. And I explain all of that in the checklist. But this is something I know for a fact a lot of people overlook. And it's also confusing because a lot of people tell you that you don't have to worry about this anymore. And I don't think that is true, especially with all the analog emulations. I think it's definitely true, and it's a good habit to just prevent the red lights from turning on, and to not only that, but send healthy levels into plugins, which doesn't only mean not clipping.
Totally. I do this differently, but to the same result. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, in this video, I also show you what I'm going for. And if you find a better or different way to do it in your workflow, feel free to do that. The result is all that matters. I'm just showing you my workflow, and I definitely show you the why. So you can take that why and apply it differently.
Yeah,
sure.
I would say though that how you do it is like the quickest way to do it if you don't really understand exactly what we mean here. Like I can do it my way just because I can literally, probably just by looking at my session, I could gain stage it like pretty roughly without hearing anything. But that's, a long time, a lot of experience of looking at Pro Tools, right?
Yeah.
For people getting into this, Benny's route is actually something you can follow and understand as you do it and hear. So it's like a repeatable process, which is a huge bonus.
Yeah, it's always wise, I think, to start with the process, and then once you get comfortable with it, you can change the process. But don't start with your own process until you have one that actually works.
Yep.
It's like that. Okay, so that is that basic gain staging. Then the next step is finding the right balance, and this is. We made an initial balance first, an intuitive sort of reaction to the song, but now it's like really finding the actual balance, like fine tuning that. Now we have our gain structure, we have our notes from the initial discovery phase, but now we do the actual balancing. Balancing means correct level balances level relationships between the individual parts. And I don't only talk about it in terms of level relationships, but also in terms of a frequency balance, like bass content versus upper mid-range and presence and top end. And so there's a balance in the frequency spectrum. And then there's a volume balance, like between a kick and a snare, for example, or a vocal and a bass or something, overall balance without plugins. Like I'm not saying manipulate the EQ to achieve the frequency balance. That's part of mixing too, and we'll get to that. But in this part of it, it's like just balancing out what you already have, finding a good spot for everything, because you can get pretty far without manipulating those sounds, especially if the source tracks are good. So I'm going to walk you through why it's wise to start with the loudest part, how you set levels and panning there, why I set up the mix bus early in the mix at this point, and why you can do that once you have the proper levels, basically, and why that helps you, and why I think it helps if you use a mix bus processor. Then I show you how I use a spectrum analyzer to help you balance better in terms of frequency, but also in terms of volume. There's some tricks that I use. And I'd like to say I developed some of them, but I'm sure I'm not the only one doing it. I just come up with my own way of doing it. But I use a spectrum analyzer for all kinds of things, and I know exactly what I have to look for to confirm what I hear, or to tell me that what I'm hearing is probably not right.
Yeah.
So, and I shall show you exactly how I use those tools to achieve that. Because I think if you are in a less than ideal monitoring situation, and if you don't have years of experience, it's absolutely beneficial to not only use your ears, but also look with your eyes and use your eyes sometimes.
Yeah.
Even though people might tell you differently, but I think it's a good idea to know how to use an analyzer and certain meters.
These tools exist for a reason.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, make use of them if they're helpful for you. This whole finding the right balance step, like you said, like starting at the loudest part and why that's beneficial, setting up your mix bus. This is kind of like creating the outline, or like the framing the picture you're going to be painting inside of. It's like a really crucial step, because otherwise you don't know where the borders are of where you can push things and stuff. So this gives you kind of a frame to paint inside of, and is 100% crucial.
Yes, absolutely, exactly. The frame is a great analogy. Like you're building the frame that you're going to paint inside of. Absolutely. Okay, then perspective. We touched on that. Step 5 on the checklist, but this is a general thing throughout the process. We touched on it quickly. It's important that you don't get too close to your song, which is hard as a DIY musician, of course, a DIY producer. But it's very, very important in mixing. So I show you a couple of techniques that I use to keep that perspective. This includes, I think, and work in stems of groups and instruments. So I might mute certain types of instruments and only work on some, and then I might mute those and work on others to give me a completely different perspective. If you switch from a low-end instrument to a high-end, top-end instrument, everything changes. You focused on one part of the frequency spectrum a lot, and now you hear something completely different, and it takes a little while to adjust to that, which gives you a fresh perspective. So I try to do things like that. I check my balance on headphones and speakers sometimes. I don't switch to a lot of different playback sources, but at least headphones and speakers I go back and forth between sometimes. And I think you should do that if you don't spend 8 hours a day every day in your studio like I am. So you definitely should have a good pair of headphones for reference, I think.
Yep.
And then I check balance at basically the 3 different volumes that I told you about in the beginning, or that we told you about, because our ears and our brain can focus on different parts of the spectrum better when we listen quietly compared to when we listen loudly. So most people can hear top end better when we listen to a mix quietly. We hear if the top end is clear, if there is distortion, if the cymbals are just way too loud or buried. You can hear that very well when you turn it down. If you crank it a lot and you try to listen to the cymbals, our ears are it's almost like we're protecting ourselves. The cymbals just are not clear anymore. We feel the bass a lot when it's loud, so that's good. But the top end is very hard to judge. It's almost like, it's just a protection thing, I think.
It's pretty bizarre, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So perspective, this is various ways in this video to keep perspective. And I think this is really, really important. And I wonder, Malcolm, if you have any tools, tricks, and techniques to keep that perspective when you mix.
I'm very similar. I've got my couple volume positions that I check out always. I do like the even quieter, like turn it down until I can only hear one thing kind of thing. And that generally tells you what's the loudest part of your mix. And sometimes you'll be surprised at what you can hear when you turn it as low as you can. I check on headphones, check on my speakers. I like to do a phone playback as well. I just kind of like, once a mix is done, I'm usually feeling pretty stoked. So throughout the rest of the day after I've left the studio, I'll probably throw it on my phone. I'll throw it on my little Google speaker. I just want to keep listening to it and hearing it in different ways. And then generally that might give me a couple clues. And then the next day I'll come back and actually just make 1 or 2 more tweaks and then send it off.
Awesome. Yeah, really cool. The different playback systems is huge. And in the beginning, especially, I think. I have to admit that I don't do car tests as much anymore. Like, not at all, actually.
Car is pretty rare for me.
Yeah.
I think this is actually something we should do an episode maybe on. But the listening on different systems things, people don't understand what they're meant to hear when they do that. And I've had it where people go and listen on, they get the mix, they listen with their best headphones, and they're like, cool. And then they go and they listen on like their mono Bluetooth speaker, and they're like, it sounds totally different. Yes, it's going to sound totally different on everything. They're different in different places as well. Yeah. At different volumes, most likely. So people don't really understand that that's just how it is. It's more so that you're listening for something that's an issue on one of these. Like you might find that like the percussion, like you got a tambourine that's just like so harsh when you listen to it on headphones that just seems to be fine when you're on your like nice speakers or something. Like that's kind of what you're looking for. You don't expect it to just be like the same everywhere.
Yes, absolutely. It's very interesting you say that people say it's different. That's kind of the point, right?
Yeah.
And you shouldn't freak out about it. But it's pretty common actually when we send out mixes to clients as well, to mixing clients, they'll listen to it in the car or on their phone or something, and then they will be like, it's cool, but when I listen on this or that, the bass is crazy or whatever. And of course, I double check and see if there's really an issue with the bass. But oftentimes, they freak out because they've never analyzed anything else the way they analyze their own music. Mm-hmm. And they think that something's wrong with their mix. And then I tell them, like, have you listened to other stuff on the same system? And is the bass crazy maybe there too? And then they do that and then figure out, oh, actually everything sounds kind of low and heavy on this thing, but I've never noticed, but they, for the first time, they pay attention really well when they listen to their own stuff.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it's the system that they're listening on and not the mix. But yeah, it's a pretty normal part of it.
Totally. That's another good reason cars are kind of out of favor, is because everybody's got their EQs on their car system all out of whack.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Totally.
Bass is cranked like 12 dB.
Yeah. Yep. That's a good one too. Yeah. Okay. So perspective. Then this is one section that I think is really cool. I call it balancing hacks. This is tricks that I use when I mix. So there's one that I call the beatbox trick. You got to watch the video if you want to know what that is. I think it really helped me a lot. And I'm going to show you how to achieve that, how to do that. It's about balance. I can say that it's about balancing the finding the right balance between the kick, snare, and vocals, the drums and the vocals. Because to me, the beat and the vocals are often the most important parts of a mix. It's the groove, the thing that makes you move to the song, that drives the song. And then also the vocal is obviously important in most cases. So, and balancing those two is very important to me, even more so than finding the right guitar balance. You can get away with like slightly too quiet or too loud guitars, but I think the center of it, the groove plus the vocal, that just has to sit right. And there's something I do here that I call the beatbox trick. Then I use a view meter. There's a view meter trick, and this is not, I didn't come up with that. I saw that from Jakir King, who—
I know the one.
Yeah, who uses a view meter to analyze the balance between the kick and the low and the bass. So basically, or the low end of the kick and the bass, how to get that part right when it comes to volume. It's not the end all be all or the only method to do that, but it's fascinating to me how close I am every single time. These days, I don't often use the trick to get there. I just do whatever I do, but then I sometimes use it to double check or to just out of curiosity to see where I landed. And if I do this trick and I do the analysis with the view meter, I'm pretty much in the ballpark every single time. So there's definitely truth to that.
Yeah, these hacks can be useful just as a peace of mind tool. Like you just trust your gut, and then like if you're like kind of struggling with it and you can't really figure out what's going on, you can pull up one of these moves and be like, oh, okay, I see. Like this is telling me, this is literally showing me that this bass guitar is too loud. And that once I've corrected that, it all kind of falls into place.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's another trick that I think is, I saw multiple people do this before, and I did it. Well, I also have done it for a long time, which is sometimes I create a mix that I like. And the way I set up my session is I have 5 main buses that everything goes to. It's my drums, my bass, my guitars. So I have drum bus, bass bus, rhythm guitar bus, lead bus, and vocal bus. These 5 buses that everything goes to. And so sometimes, most of the time these stay around 0. I don't do a lot of balancing on those faders. At the beginning of the mix, I do most of it on other groups and individual tracks. But sometimes I have a mix that I like, but I think I kind of lost perspective. I'm flying too close, or I don't know what I'm doing anymore, or whatever. And if that's the case, I don't want to start all over again and mess up everything. But I can easily just turn down these 5 buses and rebalance the mix on the buses again, just with a different perspective. And so what I'll often do is, instead of starting with the kick and snare, the drums, what I usually do, I might bring down all those main buses so I don't hear anything. And then I start by bringing up the guitars first, the rhythm guitars. So I start with this big block of mid-range, basically. And then I bring in the bass maybe to see if it adds low end to the guitars in a good way and how those two go together. And then I might bring in, I don't know, maybe the vocals and see if they have space within that block of mid-range. And then at the end, I might bring up the drums and see if the pulse fits in, if the top end, if the cymbals take over the top end in a good way, and just doing it differently or in reverse, basically, or I don't know what you want to call it, but just differently on those buses gives me a new perspective. And I sometimes it confirms what I've already done, but sometimes I end up at a slightly different balance than what I've done before. And this just helps me. And I show you exactly how to do that. I do this all with an example song in the video. And so this is the third hack here.
I don't think I've ever actually done that. And I like the idea of it quite a bit. There's so much information to fit into the mid-range. So I think this makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's just different to me. When you start with the drums and then you bring up the guitars, well, of course that works too. And that's what I do most of the time when I mix. But it's sometimes different than compared to starting with that mid-range and then and then seeing what happens when you pull up the other things. Because sometimes I feel like I have to. So first of all, this helps with the balancing, but this also helps because it shows you that it shows you if things are clashing. Because what happens sometimes is you start with the guitars and then you bring up the vocal, for example, and you find you have to turn up the vocal really, really loud in order for it to be really audible and intelligible and and it's just too loud. It's just, if you turn it down, it's kind of buried. And so it's hard to find a sweet spot the way it is. And that tells you that you have to make space for it in the guitars, or there's something else that needs to be fixed. And it's not purely a balancing issue. And I can focus on that better if I do it that way sometimes, or if I do it in a different order.
That makes sense. Totally.
Cool. All right. Then the next step. So you have, at this point, you have a balance that works. You've used some different tricks and methods, and you've learned them to create a good volume balance throughout the song. Now, all of this has been static, basically. You've just turned up the faders, you adjusted the clip gain and gain structure and all those things. You've discovered the song. And now you don't want a static mix, of course. And most of us are aware, or like not most of us, I shouldn't say that. A lot of people are aware that there is automation that you can use. And you typically do that at the end of the mix. Most people do, where you ride faders at the end of the mix and make sure that it's not a static mix, but it moves. You turn up certain parts, you turn down certain parts in certain areas, you automate effects and all of that. But I have an additional step quite at the beginning of the mix still that I use, and this is what I'm talking about in this bring it to life step here, which is I go through the song part by part and I identify and confirm focal points. So again, go back to your notes from the discovery phase, where you've discovered the song and you might have listened to the chorus and you're like, okay, definitely the vocal plus this harmony, this is really what the chorus is. This is the essence of this chorus. So I have to focus on that. And then there might be another part where you're like, there is this cool bass lick that keeps, repeating or whatever. And that's really what I need to bring out in this part, because that's the thing about this part. And so you go back to your notes and you either confirm the focal points you already found, or you now identify those part by part. And now you, without automating the fader, you now might want to bring up, just with clip gain, you might want to bring up certain parts a little or bring down certain parts a little. You want to manipulate it's like manipulating the source tracks, the raw tracks that you have, just to mimic what would happen if someone played quiet parts actually quiet and played louder in the loud parts. You want to create a natural dynamic throughout the song, like a band who has a natural dynamic. And I liked that a lot, because that pushes these dynamics into my processing, into the plugins. And I want to get to a point where I want to hit play and I want to be able to listen through the whole song, and I want to have the basic big picture macro dynamics there. I want to hear a loud part as a loud part, and I want to hear a quiet part as a quiet part. And I want to make sure that I'm sort of on an emotional journey throughout the song before I even add any effects to touch anything, because that will make it so much easier for me to then put even more emphasis on that with my processing. And I just want to hear a finished song. I don't know. I want to get to that point really quickly. So in this bring it to life step, I do that. You identify and confirm focal points, you create forward motion, and you turn the static balance into an emotional journey. And I know that when I sent this resource to some of my coaching students, they were like, but don't you do that at the end with automation? And I'm like, yes, you do that too, but I like to have this additional step. And ideally, you don't have to do this. Ideally, you have source tracks that already do this. That's the perfect world, exactly. Right? But if the source tracks aren't as dynamic as they should be, and if the parts just don't feel right, I absolutely go in and with clip gain, just turn down or up certain parts so that I can just hit play and listen to the song without constantly wanting to change everything when a new part comes in.
Yeah. I mentioned at the beginning that you can reverse engineer these tips and steps to make better recordings in the producing and engineering phases. And this is like exactly that. It's like if you get to the solo and it doesn't feel like the band is like kicked into overdrive and it's meant to, you should try and make that happen while you're recording, of course. Like why isn't that guitar pushing a little harder? Why isn't the drummer hitting harder at that section? But with clip gain, we're kind of like artificially adding a little, even like a step further if we need to, and just making things get louder there. So you can totally take this and just apply it to your recording process.
Absolutely. Yeah, love it. And you have the luxury of doing that because you can go back to the source material and change things, You'll learn a lot about your recording process, but you also can actually go back and fix things when you discover problems in the mix. You don't have to, it's not the same as when Malcolm and I are mixing songs and we have to get back to the bands and ask them if they can redo stuff. That's always pretty tedious. But you can just be like, okay, you know what, before we try and fix this now, let's just re-record it properly. You can do that.
Or add another track, Like it's like if it doesn't lift when you're listening to it, what would make it lift,
Yeah, exactly. This brings us to step 8, which is finish the rough mix. And this is, you'll listen to the rough that you now have. It's still a rough because you haven't used any processing, with the exception of like essential effects, of course. Like when I say it without plugins, it means if there is something that's just part of the source tone, basically like an amp sim or something that's critical, of course, keep them on. But like without any other mixing techniques that you might typically immediately go to, like no EQing, no compression, none of that, you should be able to you should now have a rough mix that sounds like a song. Not polished maybe, but like a song. And now you listen to that, you identify problems, and as we said, you fix the source if you can. And so you want to arrive at the point where you have a professionally produced rough, basically, that sounds great without a lot of tweaking necessary. Now, I'd say reference carefully and quickly at this point too. up until that point, I'd go with the gut feeling and flow and these techniques that I show you and some of the analysis things. But I wouldn't spend too much time referencing too early in the process because it will be confusing, I think. At this point now, you can quickly and carefully use some references and see if you're in the ballpark, if some things are crazy loud compared to your favorite songs or way too quiet. But do it quickly and carefully. Don't let it confuse you because ultimately it's subjective, and sometimes listening to references can just be demotivating, and it's not really, it's the same thing as with knowing your speakers. You got to know what you actually listen for. You got to see it as the extreme boundaries maybe, or you want to be in the ballpark, but the goal is not to recreate another mix, and this is what a lot of people start doing when they reference a lot. Now, when the rough mix sounds like a song and you know that you're in the ballpark and you like all of those decisions and it just feels right, save that and print it. Very important, because you've now gotten to a point pretty quickly, hopefully, that works, and you worked on that really carefully, and it's easy to completely ruin that once you get to compression, EQ, and all the other mixing techniques. It's very easy to completely mess that up. It's pretty hard, especially at the beginning, to be disciplined and keep your gain structures intact and compensate for any level changes you make and all of those things that you do in mixing. And you'll get even closer to the mix you're working on, and before you know it, you'll have something different, but you messed up all the stuff that you've worked so carefully on in those first steps here. So I definitely say save the rough mix. So you can, when in doubt, you can just go back and start from there again. And absolutely also print it as a reference that you can and load it up in your session so that you can go back and forth quickly between the rough and what you have right now. Yep. Because now you know that the balances are right. You know it feels right. You carefully done the balancing, which is the most important thing about mixing. And now later, you want to be able to check if you still have that balance or if something got crazy loud or out of control in the process.
Yeah. And it might be like when you're comparing, it's fine if it's different, but make sure you like it more, So it's like, oh, it something did change. Do I like it more or less, So volume match it and then check.
Yeah. And then the final steps are, and this is, I'm going to say it, but then I'm going to tell you what I think about it. The final steps are refine the mix bus and other buses and groups. At least for me, this is what I do first. I want to make sure that the frame is correct that I'm listening through and mixing through. So I might do some tweaking there and see if what I had initially still works. And then I go to the heavy lifting part of processing where I do cleanup EQ. So I go back to my mental notes or my actual notes from the balancing process, and I clean up resonances, mud, things that clashed, things that I noticed that I couldn't solve with balance that I need to EQ to make them work, which is now way easier because you spent the time learning the tracks, learning what's on the tracks, making sure to get a balance without processing. And only once you got to a point where it's not possible, you know that you need to fix it with EQ, which is now easier because you can do it intentionally. Then and you won't touch the things that already work. Then there's sweetening EQ where it might work, but it just needs a little more low end or top end or whatever to polish it. Then there's compression. If there are things in the discovery process, in the balancing, that no matter what you did, they just didn't sit right. They were jumping all over the place, like sometimes too loud, sometimes too quiet. You know that you need to limit their dynamics. You know that you need to compress this more. So all of these first steps are giving you the information you need to then do the other things. And if you skip all of the stuff, all of the balancing, all of the things we've been talking about, it's way harder to make good EQ decisions, good compression decisions. You won't listen in context. You will listen in isolation, and you won't know what you actually want to do. But if you did it properly, you can then EQ better, more easily, faster. You can compress better. You know what to touch and what not to touch. So the heavy lifting part of it is way easier for me. And then finishes off with vibe and character and effects type of things. And I might add parallel processing, might not do that. Sometimes I do it. This is kind of advanced because it also messes with the balance again. So if you do that and you bring in additional channels in parallel, they change the volume. So you might have to go back and check the rough mix that you hopefully printed. And then I have the final automation step where I do the actual fader rides and automation at the end to really make it move. And that's sort of my mixing process. And the way I went through this checklist now, you saw that the emphasis, and this is also what this video and checklist is about, is really on the first steps, not on the EQ and compression techniques and all of that, because that's the part that takes a lot of experience and time, and where there's no way around experimenting there and learning that. But getting balancing right, getting the relationships right between the different volumes, the different things on your faders, defining what is the focal point, defining the macro dynamics throughout the song, identifying things that are clashing, all these things. This is really the most important part of it. And that's why I'm focusing so much on it in this checklist and in this video. And the rest of it is necessary, but can be learned quicker and easier once you've done that. And it just will take time until you get really good at it. And I swear, if you do the balancing part right and all the things that we've talked about on this episode, then your mix, even without extensive processing, will sound better than most people's mixes, because nobody is really doing this. I know for a fact, because I'm listening to so many mixes from people that I work with and from people that I help and coach and teach. When they start out, nobody does this. They might be using 5 EQs on each track and 3 compressors and a lot of effects and all those things, but nobody has a really good balance and a really good panning and a clear focal point and a movement throughout the song and all these things. Nobody really. So if you do that and learn that, your song will connect better with the audience than most other mixes. It's true.
Yeah, and your job of doing all of, the fun stuff, like messing with compressors and EQs, becomes so much more intuitive and easy, and actually you have a balance to work with. You need that foundation to get started and actually be effective with all those fun tools. So it's crucial.
Yes. And I'd like to, again, say that balance, a lot of people talk about balancing and how important that is. But to me, balancing is not a static thing where you find a fader balance and that's your balance. To me, it really is also defining these focal points, doing it part by part, creating a really good performance, manipulating the source tracks if necessary, and just making sure that the balance is right for every part, not for the whole song as a whole, basically. Because it's a thing that moves ideally. It's about this emotional journey. It's about the forward motion throughout the mix. And so balancing to me is not a static thing. Finding the right balance is an emotional thing. And it can be, it's not as simple as that. And I often see when people talk about balancing, it's not, I don't know. I think about it differently. I think about it as a thing that constantly changes. And it starts with making the source track really work well throughout all the parts.
Yeah, you got to balance, part to part, and it's something that you'll keep doing as well. This list is lists in their, by virtue of what they are linear ordered steps kind of thing. But every one of these steps essentially is getting gone back to repeatedly throughout the process, at least for me. And it's like, okay, I've nailed the kick sound finally, kind of thing. It just locked into place. But that has made the verse a little bit more bombastic than I wanted it to be. So I got to go back and alter that section to make it less bombastic. Or, that's just a random example. But it's kind of like a constant revert to balancing mode thing that I'm constantly doing through the mix.
Yes. Absolutely, for sure. So any other thoughts on this, Malcolm? Anything you want to add?
Well, I mean, just kind of what I just said is that for me, it's not as linear as this, but again, it's important that I'm hitting all of the steps and that all of these are happening. So you'll kind of figure out your own workflow that works for you. But I highly encourage you, if you grab this free resource, it's free. There's nothing to lose by doing this, right? So you should absolutely grab it and follow along in order with what Benny outlines here. Watch the video, go through it with him, and make this your process in order. Even if you want to try and do it a different way and change up the order and create your own process, you should do that. But start with taking it in how Benny has laid it out here, because it's really strategic. By doing it this way, you'll kind of see the advantages of each of these steps. And then if once you're familiar with it, you can kind of go off and do your own thing. But I think to get the most out of this resource, follow along with the video.
Agreed. So thank you. Now, if you want to have this, go to the selfrecordingband.com/standout mixes. And if you go to the show notes page of this episode, you'll find the link there too. And I can't wait to hear your thoughts on this. And I know that the reactions I got from coaching students were things like, and I'm reading this here, like, true eye-opener for me. What a great resource. Never thought about balancing that way. Mixes immediately got better. So these were the comments that I got from coaching students on this resource.
Awesome.
And so I can't wait to hear your thoughts on this. Again, the selfrecordingband.com/standout mixes. All right, that's it for today. And I can't wait to talk to you next week.
Yeah, we'll see you then.
Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.